Good afternoon. As the 1 o'clock hour strikes, I want to introduce Dari, who is going to walk us through this webinar. We are very excited you were able to join us today. And if you have any issues, go ahead and email that email address that was in the body of the invitation, just aferris@nfu.org. And we'll try to get them fixed. This is our first webinar, so we're looking forward to learning a lot about biosolids and webinars. So Dari, if you want to lead us, that would be great.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us for our informational webinar titled Biosolids as a Soil Amendment, Critical Issues to Consider. My name is Dari Sticker, and I'm welcoming you today as a representative and board member of the Pennsylvania Farmers Union.
Oh, it looks like maybe Dari has hopped off for a second, maybe a bad connection. I think we were excited to start with Dr. Murray, so we'll quick get him queued up, perhaps until she gets back. Dr. Murray, are you with us?
McBride, sorry, my name is...
Or sorry, McBride, I'm so sorry.
Yes, I am here.
Awesome. I don't suspect that this is your slide, perhaps, but Dari may have just gotten back on.
That's Dari's slide, yes.
Okay. Dari, are you back joining? There you are.
I am. I will keep an eye on that muted button. If we can just go back to, just back once. Just, so I just want to catch everyone up. We'll be discussing about products marketed as a fertilizer to farmers, landscapers, home gardeners. This product's made from sewage sludge waste. It's also known as biosolids. For some, biosolids are a soil amendment or a source of nitrogen and phosphorus. For others, the biosolids as a fertilizer presents a concern about transferring contamination. Farms and let's see. We, of course, welcoming Dr. McBride, our lead soil scientist from Cornell University, who's speaking with us today, and Fred Stone, the Maine dairy farmer, who will offer his experience using biosolids and how it devastated his family farm. I'll give you just a brief overview of the basics. So next slide, please. Okay, so what is sludge or biosolids? There we go. There we go. It's everything that goes down the drain of homes, businesses, industries, hospitals, wastewater treatment plants, and publicly owned treatment works. So a lot of times you'll see wastewater treatment plant or publicly owned treatment works. They're basically the same thing. It's where everything goes down the pipe to be treated. Sewage solids are treated, and of course all of you can read this, by heating it, adding chemicals to kill certain viruses and bacteria. The heat is to also work on those things. The solids are then squeezed to extract the water, and that water is to return to the local community. It's called a wastewater treatment plant. And so the goal of that industry was to clean water so that we would have water to consume, not to make fertilizer. So the sewage sludge and biosolids that are remaining, and that's what's the solid remaining from the wastewater treatment plants and publicly owned treatment works. Okay, next slide, please. And as you can see, this is just a drawing of the process of how a wastewater treatment plant works. The waste going in, everything that you flushed down the drain. They clean it. You can see the drawing here. And of course, if you ever get a chance to tour one of the wastewater treatment plants, it's very interesting to see what happens with everything that goes down the drain. Next slide, please. Our sewage sludge waste is broken into classes. And in this way, Class A is marketed as essentially pathogen-free. Class B is marketed as low levels of pathogens. And exceptional quality is to have lower metals. But all of them have the same requirements for what is tested for, which we will talk about a little bit later. Keep in mind that Class A and Class B have the same levels of metal. Exceptional quality and Class A can be marketed for things like bag fertilizer or lawn care or things like that to home gardeners. And of course the uses are for fertilizer, but it can be marketed as a compost. It can be dried into pellets or used as a liquid, and then used for landfill or land application. Okay, next slide. This gives us a nice overview of how the 8 million tons of sewage sludge and biosolids that are generated from 14,700 public-owned treatment works or wastewater treatment plants. This shows us how that sewage sludge is used. 36% in agriculture, 11% in Class A. So again, these can be, especially the Class A, can be marketed for landscaping, lawn care, parks, playgrounds, athletic fields. So this gives you just a little bit an overview of how these things are, how the sewage waste is used. Okay, let's see. I think next slide, please. So this is a really interesting slide about let me see. I'm sorry, I've lost my place. This is a real interesting slide about how bag fertilizers and lawn care can have biosolids as in their product, and which bag fertilizers don't have biosolids. This is a really good slide that was created by the Water Environmental Federation, or WEF, which is the Sewage Sludge Industries Group. They track the national wastewater treatment plants and their end products, including tracking what contaminants are in those products. Okay, next slide, please. So what are our critical issues? The contamination is the largest thing we're looking at. There's thousands of chemicals from industrial solvents, pharmaceuticals, detergents. All of these products are untested for with animal and human safety, lack of standards or oversights, and most of all, the user's not informed, whether it's the farmer accepting a product marketed as a soil amendment or whether it's a bag fertilizer. Again, considering that publicly owned treatment works and wastewater treatment plants were created to clean the water, not to create fertilizer. And it's really, by calling it a fertilizer, many of the chemicals don't have to be tested for. Next slide, please. So what are the only things that are required testing? Nationally, the Environmental Protection Agency sets standards on and regulations on what's required for testing. Each state can make stronger regulations, but nationally, the testing only requires for 9 heavy metals and 2 indicator bacteria. That's all. So when you think of everything that went down the drain, these are the only things that you have to test for to market this product as a soil amendment or fertilizer. Okay, next slide, please. As we can see, what's not tested for is rather large. And this includes all of the heavy metals, pathogens, pharmaceuticals, steroids, plus, as you see the list here. Many of the contaminants are being called emerging contaminants, but they've really been tracking these for years. Dr. McBride will talk a little more about the concerns about contamination in sewage sludge and biosolids waste and the implications on soil health and plant uptake. But again, one of the reasons that we're doing this presentation is the chemical known as PFAS, or polyfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are flame retardant, found in every sample of biosolids and sludge nationally. Next slide, please. In November of 2019, the EPA published this important report titled EPA Unable to Assess the Impact of Hundreds of Unregulated Pollutants on Land-Applied Biosolids on Human Health and the Environment. This is just to show you, you can just Google this. The EPA does a one-page, that's called this at a glance. But both the at a glance and the full report are available online on the EPA website. But it does highlight, even in this one page, that the EPA has concerns about, and including 352 pollutants, including 61 designated as acutely hazardous or priority pollutants in other programs. This is a big eye-opener for us about what's going through the sewage sludge, biosolids, onto our land and into our food supply. Next slide, please. So nationally, what a concern that we hear around the country is what is the EPA doing to regulate or make our food and water supply safer? And here what we note is that both the EPA and the FDA have admitted that PFAS is getting through our sewage sludge into our food and water supply. Of course, other sources too, they highlight the flame retardants and plastic wraps. But our concern is the sewage sludge. So PFAS is found in every sample of sewage sludge nationally. There's no change in the sludge and biosolids testing requirements for over 30 years. There's no established safe consumption of the amount of PFAS that we should be eating. No testing requirements, and no legal limits for PFAS in foods. Okay, next slide. So what's the big deal? Our long-term contamination of your soil, water, livestock, and crops, if you're a farmer, our human health, because contaminants like PFAS are bioaccumulative. They build up in the soil in your body. We have concerns for farmers, especially with financial losses. And of course, the social implication of communities that are living where the sewage sludge is spread. Okay, next slide, please. And finally, here's just a little breakdown of some of the things we're seeing very recently. These are not old issues. Of course, we're specifically concerned about the PFAS, including the implications on our keynote speaker, Fred Stone, but also, as in this slide, another dairy farmer, Art Schaap, out in New Mexico, had to euthanize 4,000 of his cows. They were contaminated by the water. The Colorado farm that used irrigation supply that was contaminated with PFAS. Wisconsin also halting the land application, and then some of the food sources like Ocean Spray independently testing for things like PFAS, and then turning away crops and farmers. So that's just a quick overview. I don't want to take up a whole lot of time. Thank you for your time. I hope this helps give you an overview. So I will say next slide, please. And happy to welcome Dr. McBride. Pardon me for just 1 second. So what I'm happy to help. Happy to welcome Dr. McBride. Dr. McBride's been a professor of soil chemistry and soil and crop sciences at Cornell for over 40 years. His research interests include the chemistry of trace elements, toxic metals in soil, and mechanisms of their transfer to soil, from soil to crops. His work includes an interest in urban gardening and farming, as well as methods of reducing contamination in urban grown foods and in remediation of pollutant soils. So I will turn it over to Dr. McBride. Thank you.
Okay, oh, am I on?
Yep, you're good.
I'm good? Okay, thanks, Dari.
Mhm.
So, yes, my research focus in the past has been on the toxic metals, and if we could go to the next slide, I would, um, yeah, just introduce, first of all, I'll be covering to some degree what Dari said, only in a little more detail. So the proponents of beneficial use of sewage sludges or biosolids as farm fertilizers, of course, point out that you're recycling nitrogen and phosphorus from human waste, as well as some other micronutrients. And then you have the soil benefits of these nutrients and buildup of soil organic matter. This, of course, would have the benefit for the farmers of offsetting costs of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer, which would normally have to be purchased. And in most cases, I would say, it does represent a low-cost disposal option for the municipality. Next slide, please. Okay, but let's look a little more carefully at the nutrient levels in these sludges. They're very highly variable and unbalanced. By that I mean unbalanced relative to what crops need. These are some numbers here at the top from Penn State data. Organic matter content varies from 40 to 70%, which is kind of interesting because you kind of wonder what the rest of the material is, because human waste would be theoretically close to 100% organic matter, dry weight. So there's other material in there, clearly. The total nitrogen, 4.7 plus or minus 1.1%, phosphorus around 2.3 plus or minus almost 1%, and potassium is quite low, 0.31 plus or minus 0.27, which means sometimes it's negligible. The first point is that the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio in this material for most sludges is not well matched to the crop needs. In New York State, we apply sludges based on the nitrogen requirements of the crops. Usually, if you do this, and most farmers would do that, you are loading too much phosphorus on the soil over time. So there's a buildup of phosphorus in these soils. You also don't have enough potassium relative to the other nutrients, and you would have to supplement with potassium fertilizer depending on the soil. So it's not an ideal fertilizer at all, and it would have to be managed carefully. Michigan DEQ also shows in their extension bulletin an even wider range of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You see there at the bottom on the slide, a surprising range, which would mean, again, for an individual batch of this material land applied, management, especially of the nitrogen and phosphorus, would be very difficult. Next slide, please. Now, that's the beneficial use side of it. So you can use these nutrients, but the problem then is there are the negative aspects, which if you're really being serious about beneficial use, you would have to balance those positives of nutrients and organic matter against these other factors. And the question is which comes out being the dominant factor to consider. And in my view, these negatives outweigh the positives. The buildup of contaminants, and this includes pathogenic organisms, metals, and synthetic organic chemicals, of which there are thousands, mean that you potentially contaminate food crops, dairy products, and meat. You also have, I've studied reduced forage quality on pastures and forage crops where uptake of metals like molybdenum and uptake of elements like sulfur can lead to livestock health problems. There is also groundwater contamination, which is rarely monitored even on longer-term application sites. So the groundwater contamination could include nitrate, phosphate, and even metals, I suppose, in some cases. In the long term, you may end up building up enough heavy metals that, particularly zinc and copper, could reach levels that impact crop growth. This isn't really an issue for human health, but this is an issue for soil health. So again, back to the excess nutrients, too much of a good thing, too much nitrogen and phosphorus. We have in New York State dairy farms that are applying sewage sludge, which sounds pretty crazy because these farms, at least if you look at the overall farm nutrient balance, they already have too much nitrogen and phosphorus from the manures to be able to manage and handle it. To import additional nitrogen and phosphorus seems not a good thing to be doing. So we have surface water and groundwater contamination by nitrate, phosphate, and chemicals possible, especially as the phosphate levels build up in these soils over time. More than 50% of our soils now in agricultural areas in upstate have excessive phosphorus soil tests, meaning they don't need more phosphorus and they should have less. And we have the odor and bioaerosol problem, the off-site impacts. Dari mentioned that. I have encountered this numerous times, various examples I could give. Effects on human health of people living adjacent to land application sites. And finally, I stress again, the tremendous variability and unpredictability of the composition of sludges. It's not like there's one sludge out there which has a particular composition. They're all over the place. And a small treatment plant only has to analyze the sludge once a year. Larger ones maybe 3 to 4 times a year. There can be a lot of variability in between. Next slide, please. So what are the EPA rules on this? The state rules have tended to more or less follow the EPA rules. So I'll mention the EPA ones, of course. Dari said that there are 9 metals that are regulated, and none of the toxic organic chemicals are under any regulation under the 503 rule, which came into effect back in 1993. The EPA allowed limits, even if you argue that, yes, there are regulations for these metals. Those regulations are extremely permissive and much, much higher in allowed loadings of metals on soil than in other countries such as Northern Europe. And they're based on this 1993 risk assessment, which used very old data now. A lot of the data that went into that risk assessment came from the 1960s, 70s, and into the 1980s. So we're talking about really old information and very non-cautious assumptions in the risk assessments. The present day sludges do contain metals that are toxic but aren't regulated. You know, there are elements like organotin and thallium and so on, which may be in some sludges, maybe not frequently, but that are very toxic and are not on the regulated list. The metals generally stay put in the soil over time. Very little loss of them occurs. So copper and zinc, as I said, do build up more or less in proportion to the number of years that sludge is applied. And some of these elements are taken up by forages and by food crops. For example, cadmium. Cadmium is less of an issue than it was when I first got into this topic back in the late 70s. Cadmium was very bad in many sludges. It's much better now, but it's still not completely a solved problem. Molybdenum, as I mentioned before, can be a problem for animal health. Okay, next slide. The pathogens in Class B sludge, it's important to point out that the particular testing that's required is very minimal. The testing required under EPA is for fecal coliform and or salmonella indicator bacteria. There is no virus testing required. These indicator bacteria are supposed to tell you what other organisms have been killed. And all they require is that there be less than 2 million coliform colonies per gram of sludge to allow land spreading of a Class B sludge. So that's 2 million or less. Class B sludges contain, besides E. coli, 0157, the notorious organism, besides these bacteria, the sludges contain viruses of various sorts, protozoa, Giardia and Cryptosporidium particularly, and helminths, which are parasitic worms. every pathogenic virus shed in human feces are in there. That includes adenovirus, astrovirus, calicivirus, enterovirus, hepatitis A, hepatitis E, rotavirus, and so on. And some of these were not well known if you go back 20 or 30 years. And they're still being researched as to their effects on human health. But some of these are quite serious, can cause disease in humans. Anaerobic digestion in the wastewater treatment plant reduces the viral numbers, but there's still, the literature states that there will still be somewhere between 100 and 10,000 viable viruses per kilogram in the treated sludge. Enteric viruses are heat resistant and tolerant of acid conditions, so they can persist. Viruses have lower infective doses than bacteria. As little as 1 to 100 viruses can give you a disease. You can control these viruses by a very well monitored composting. You need to reach 55 degrees centigrade, that's 131 degrees Fahrenheit, for 2 weeks in the material, and that should inactivate essentially all of these viruses. I don't think that's often done carefully enough to assure that a class A sludge produced by composting would be virus-free. Next slide. And then we get into the synthetic organic chemicals, which, as I said, are not regulated. There are thousands of them and new ones coming on every year. Many of these were introduced before the 503 rule was ever developed, so of course they're not dealing with them. Some of these chemicals, like the fire retardants and the perfluorinated ones, are very persistent and long-lived in soils. We call them POPs, meaning persistent organic pollutants. They build up with time because every time you apply sludge, you simply add to what's already there. Unfortunately, few of these have been studied for human or animal toxicity, so we don't really know how bad an effect they might have, but there certainly are epidemiological studies that suggest they may be a problem. Few of these chemicals have been studied for crop uptake. Some have, and there is uptake of some of them. Others do not show much uptake because they bind to soil organic matter. But anyway, the point is that none of these are regulated, and we're simply flying by the seat of our pants because we simply do not know which of these we really should be focusing on in terms of their possible effects on the ecology, on soil, and on humans. Next slide. So why the concern? Well, just to summarize then, more or less what I've been saying, many of these organic chemicals are taken up by crops. Research has shown that. Some of them are not, but many are. Many of them are bioaccumulative in livestock. These are the ones that are fat soluble, things like the brominated fire retardants, for example. So they behave like PCBs or like, in the old days, DDT. Accumulate in cows, accumulate in the milk fat of the cow, and accumulate in meat fat. So there's a concentration buildup from the soil into livestock into humans, up the food chain. Many of these organic chemicals are persistent in the soil. Their half-lives can vary from years to literally centuries or longer. Many have suspected or known human and ecological toxicity. Some are carcinogenic. Others are endocrine disrupting. I'll say a little thing about endocrine disruption in a moment here. Most are invisible. By that I mean we don't test for them, and so the proponents of sludge applications say, well, what's the problem? Because they don't see a test for these chemicals, so the assumption is there's no problem there. But a lack of evidence does not represent evidence of a lack of effect. So you simply cannot conclude anything from not having information. There are new unevaluated contaminants showing up all the time, and we're going to be surprised again, I'm sure, in the future by some new ones. So anyway, the point here is that as a scientist, I see that the scientific understanding of the behavior and toxicity of these many chemicals is lagging far, far behind the actual application of these on farms, which seems like a backwards way of doing things. Okay, next slide. So about the endocrine disrupting chemicals, now the EPA has claimed for a long time, as have other proponents of land application, that these synthetic chemicals have far too low concentration in sludges or in soil to have harmful effects. And of course, this argument is based on the old toxicological argument or paradigm that the dose makes the poison, and that makes sense for some chemicals like perhaps cadmium. Well, actually, no, not cadmium, because cadmium has proven to have some endocrine disrupting ability. But a lot of chemicals follow that rule. But the endocrine disrupting chemicals don't obey this rule because they have hormone-like behavior in animals and humans. And they operate at below parts per billion into the parts per trillion level. This is why you see such strict standards being proposed for the PFAS, the perfluorinated chemicals. There are many of these EDCs, endocrine disrupting chemicals in sludges that we know about. There probably are many more, but I'll just mention the perfluorinated ones, the PFAS, bisphenol A, which is one of the plasticizers, PCBs, they're still in some sludges, tributyl tin, brominated fire retardants, some of the pharmaceuticals, all of these are in sludges, and all of them have some endocrine disrupting effect. Next slide. So I'm getting near the end here, but just pulled out of a very recent paper. On the left-hand side, you see a couple of graphs there, and what they're showing are guideline levels given for drinking water for perfluorinated PFOA and PFOS. So these are two of the perfluorinated chemicals, and there are hundreds of these chemicals, by the way. And you'll see that in time, starting around 2002 and later, different agencies in different states, EPA and various states, have proposed widely ranging recommended guideline thresholds for these chemicals in drinking water, anywhere as low as 13 parts per billion up to 1,000. And I just want to show that to give you some idea. The trend there tends to be toward lower values since around 2014, which would mean that I guess some states are getting more cautious with time. But you know, I could pose these questions: how much PFOA or how much PFOS in soil would be sufficient to contaminate groundwater above the guidelines? I don't think we know the answer to that. How much PFOA or PFOS in soil would be sufficient to contaminate milk, dairy products, or meat? I don't know of any research at this time that could give you quantified answers to these questions. How much soil contamination could we tolerate before we would end up with these chemicals in our groundwater, drinking water, and in our food? And that's just research that has to be done. Next slide. Okay, so to end, just point out that this is not, for me, a new topic. Back in the late 90s, and it was after the 503 rule came out in 93, we published an article called The Case for Caution. Actually, the first version of it was in 1997, the later version in 1999. And our case for caution was referring to applying sewage sludge on land where we grow food, specifically. And why were we cautious? Because, number one, our ability to confidently predict risk from land application is very limited. These contaminants concentrate in the sludges. That's really what they're meant to do, because of the treatment plant is trying to treat water. Many of these are unevaluated. I would say by far the majority of them are not evaluated. There are new contaminants coming in all the time. The 503 only looks at 9 metals and 2, maybe, one or maybe 2 indicator pathogens, extremely inadequate. The present US standards are based on an outdated risk assessment, which is not cautious at all. The liability here rests with the farmer, essentially. If there's a problem on the farm, we have seen from past experience with other farmers, it's very hard for the farmer to prove the cause of the problem, whether it's animal death or crop failure or whatever it might be. Enforcement and monitoring are inadequate. I mean, our DEC in New York here admits that because they just don't have enough staff anymore to go out and see what's actually happening as opposed to what's supposed to be happening. And then we have these numerous anecdotal reports of illness, which I've become personally pretty familiar with in New York and Pennsylvania and other states. And I think that's my last slide.
Great, thank you, Dr. McBride. So that's a lot of science and leaning heavily on things that are of particular interest to farmers, like the nitrogen and phosphorus, and how this is maybe encouraged as a soil amendment. So of immediate concern, and one of the reasons that we presented this program today is the experience of our next speaker, which is Maine dairy farmer Fred Stone, and owner of Stoneridge Farm, whose farm has been in the family for over 100 years. Fred's story is important as a canary in the coal mine. The issue of sewage sludge and biosolids that are marketed as fertilizer and soil amendment, and the implications to our farms and soil health, as well as the potential contaminations to our food and water supply. So we'd like to welcome Fred Stone to our presentation. This is for you, Fred.
Very good. Thank you very much. To paraphrase, I guess, a little bit, our nightmare, as it were, started on November 3rd of 16, when we were notified by Kennybunk Water that the aquifer that we're pumping our water out of, which is an aquifer that they started pumping water out of for their municipal use, was contaminated with a level of 143, I believe the number was. And because that caused quite a bit of alarm. And so our little advisory team met, consisted of myself, my wife, my daughter, my son-in-law, my best friend, who's also my veterinarian, and our attorney, John Lambert. And that would happen probably 3 days after we got our initial letter from Kennybunk Water. So it was decided then we had two options. Option one was to say nothing, because the state doesn't test for this. Option two was to immediately notify the state that there might be a problem with the aquifer, and also notify our dairy, which is Oakhurst Dairy out of Portland, which is now owned by DFA. Obviously, we chose the latter. I mean, what else can you do? Although you would be amazed at the number of people that have told me in our industry, both organic and conventional, that I really screwed up because all I had to do was keep my mouth shut. And I'm afraid that I don't quite go along with that assumption. I mean, we drink the milk, we drink the meat, and this is a farm that's 3 generations. I've got cow families that go back over 40 years on that farm, and we're quite concerned about it. Well, anyway, so the state did come back out and they tested the water. Of course, it came back fine because they don't test for this. Oakhurst ran a milk sample, and that came back in December, right around December 13th, 14th, in there somewhere, and that was 1,400. Yes, that's 1,400. And I might add that would have been 1,400 6 months prior to that. I mean, or whenever. I mean, we don't know, because that's the first time anybody ever tested the milk for these contaminants. Well, anyway, that of course got us suspended, obviously. And now we are in survival mode, trying to figure out what the hell are we going to do. And the state, in their infinite wisdom, came out and did grid testing, because they're trying to figure out where the contamination is coming from for the aquifer, number one, and number two, also about the cows. So in the preliminary thing on this, one of the recommendations was that the state wanted to exterminate the herd. And I told them that, I said, fine. I said, if we want to exterminate the herd, then that's great. I said, well, I'll go down and you can exterminate the herd, and I'll stand right in the front row and I'll take the first bullet. And 4 days later, we got a letter from the state on suicide prevention. That's should give you, should scare a lot of people, because that's the kind of thing, because nobody really understands, I guess, the severity of this whole thing, and we've been told that we are a unicorn, that this has not happened anywhere else, which is kind of, comforting when you're dealing with a situation or a problem like this. I will say that we then went, and state came out and did grid testing of the fields. We put in a water filtration system, which is a carbon-based thing, cost us $21,000. And so within 6 months of us being notified, our water's, our water was fine. And I think that system went in on May 15th of 17 is when it was not in operation. Now, we haven't been shipping milk. We're still trying to, figure out how we're going to rectify the situation. I mean, we're kind of foolish. We're dairy farmers, so we're trying to salvage the operation. But anyway, when the soil samples came back, our high field tested out at 858,000. That was our high field. I might add that the state just came out this spring with a number that they didn't want to see anything over 3,100. Now, the thing is, the concerning part about this thing is that the last time we had done any sludge spreading on those fields was in 04. We started in 1983. Originally, we had used paper making, or from sappy paper or SD Warren at the time, sludges. And then within a year or so after that, we transitioned over and we went with Kennebunk Sewer District. And we were guaranteed by the state of Maine that through DEP that they would, through our permits and stuff, that this stuff was fine, and we were doing our civic duty by utilizing these materials. In fact, we also did a lot of custom spreading for Kennebunk on a lot of other farms in the area. And I might add, for the 21 years that we had done this, we'd also worked with the Gunkwit Sewer District, but our record as far as infractions or anything else is clean. We didn't even get as much as a speeding ticket from DEP on any of our applications. We did it by the book. So there was no off-gridding on this, on materials at all. We followed our nutrient management plans as far as loading applications, what have you. And again, we did it right by the book. So this has been a real nightmare as far as we're concerned. So anyway, that kind of moved us along where we decided that we would try to salvage the operation, and we brought in more cows. We were told by John Lambert, our attorney, our general attorney at the time, and still is, that we were not to buy any feed or any cattle from anybody in the state of Maine, because sludge spreading was quite common in the state of Maine, all over central and southern Maine, and that we wanted to be sure that any cattle or any feed that we brought in be clean. So we went out and we purchased more cattle, and we made arrangements with a couple of hay dealers in New Hampshire, and we did the same thing, and spent probably another $150,000 or so, maybe less than that, but my lender might disagree with you, trying to salvage the dairy operation. Anyway, to fast forward this mess, we ended up, we were able to get the cows down to a level. A state in between this time came up with a number that they wanted to see the milk test to be below 210. I might interject right here and tell you that the EPA number, I may have that wrong, is 400. When our Shep and I were in Washington in the spring, we were talking about this, and that's another problem where there's no continuity on any of the recommendations on any of the numbers. And of course, a lot of that has to do with nobody really realizes or has any understanding of what the hell they're dealing with. They know there's a problem, but they don't know A, how to fix it, or B, what to do about it. And states and what have you are doing their own thing. and the farmer, meaning myself, are caught in the middle of this thing. This has been a financial train wreck for us. Another problem here is that the cattle and the land that, of course, we use to collateralize our loans are now worth zero, which really makes you popular with your lender when you go in to see them and tell them that you need more money to live on. But that's the same problem that everybody else is going to be faced with as we continue to go to this other contamination places are found. This is going to be an ongoing problem. Our situation was in dairy, and then you can say, well, the solution for pollution is dilution, which is always a nice argument to use. But I would say that pollution anywhere is still pollution, whether it's what the extent of it is concerned. I will say that those fields that one that I said had the highest number, that field could have been certified organic, which ought to scare the hell out of everybody, because the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, I think their number is 3 years from sludge spreading, and then you can get your organic certification. Now that may have changed. That was this spring. Again, this thing is pretty fluid, where people are changing things as they go along. But my point is still the same, that we could have grown sweet corn or tomatoes or whatever on that field, and that would be direct contamination, as opposed to the milk, where again it was diluted with everybody else's milk. But without any mandatory testing, which I guess is probably where I'm coming from, we don't know, and nobody knows until you start doing field testing on some of these historic sites, or you start doing mandatory milk testing and then coming up with some number that is workable. And I think that's one of the problems that Oakhurst has, is that they do not have a solid number on where it is. Is the number 210, as the state of Maine has, or is it 400, which is what EPA has, or is there another number out here? And you have states that are coming up with their own numbers as far as the water is concerned. I mean, Maine's at 70, New Hampshire, I think, is in the teens. Vermont, I think, is pretty close to that. So where are the limits here? And then we get into the health situations or the health problems. We had our blood work done. Our attorneys wanted us to do that, and my daughter's blood level, everybody else's blood level should be 4 or 3 or what have you. Yours, secretary, whoever's. My daughter's number is 20. My wife's number is 91. My number is 111, which is probably, I think, one of the highest ones in New England. If you were taking, that would be. And the other situation is like our thing is through contamination, is through firefighting foam, what have you, although it's the same contaminant. Ours is through sludge spreading directly. So that's the scary thing. And there's no way of cleaning this up. This is why they call it a forever chemical, because it does not go away. And it tears itself, it layers itself. So if it's 10 today, it's 20 tomorrow, it's 30 the day after. The part that really is scary is that we haven't done any sludge spreading on those fields for 15 years, and they are just as contaminated today as they were the day we did it. And we were assured by the state that this would not be a problem. It's right in my permits that states that our soils were fine as long as we followed their recommendations, that we would not have this issue. As far as support from the state or from USDA, I would say that's been, again, minimal. I mean, it's like inviting a skunk to a church picnic. That's pretty much the way we've been treated, and that's probably putting it mildly. To say that my wife and our family are not upset or mad is an understatement. And I'm kind of getting off the rails here a little bit, and I might get kicked under the table, but in generalities, and I've skimmed over a lot because this last 36 months has been nothing but pure hell. Again, on a farm that all we've ever wanted to do was to milk our cows and be left alone. We have registered brown Swiss, registered Holsteins that makes up our herd. And again, these are families that go back over 40, 50 years. And I love my cows. And I always said, I wish rain wasn't wet, and I wish snow wasn't cold, and I wish I still didn't love my cows. And the more people I meet, the more I love my cows. So I guess I'm sorry, this is probably in a nutshell. I'm not keeping track of my time, but I would let the floor go to and move on. So.
Okay, thank you, Fred. Sorry we weren't rolling your pictures while you were speaking, but we'll just kind of roll through obviously your farm. And if you want to talk over the pictures, just give us an overview. There's about 4 photos.
That's the picture of the main house. The L part goes back to the late 1700s. The main part goes back to the early 1800s. And like I said, we've been in that house for over 100 years. That was actually taken from an aerial lift that we have, or a bucket truck. And that's one of the fields that I'm in. That's actually one of the, because our fields, we're grid tested, there are some fields that are not contaminated or fall under the 3100 number, and there are other ones that are way over the number. And because of all the testing and stuff, we were able to pick out some fields that we can still use some of the feed off from, and some fields that we can't. And this is one that we can. So other fields, we did cut all the fields, but we just haven't done it. That's another one of the fields that's actually right next to Kennebunk River. That's another problem too, because the runoff off those fields goes directly into the Kennebunk River. And yeah, that's another picture. That's at another one of the fields that we lease. And that field has not been tested. And there I am in Washington, where we were being told that they would help us, and I'm not sure about that. So school's still out on that. And that's one of my favorite animals. That's she is a seaman daughter. She was junior champion in, for both years at Deerfield Fair. And she was also showed at Freiburg too, and did really well over there. So.
Okay, great. Thank you for zipping through that. And appreciate that you touched on a lot of your firsthand experience. Sounds like including that some of the fields where you didn't use the biosolids didn't show that contamination. That's
correct. Some of the fields, like I said, we can use, and again, it was just because the fields were grid tested, and we've done some more sampling too, and we followed the guidelines on what we can do. The feed does and tested, and some of it, but there are no guidelines on what the feed numbers are going to be. So it's a moving target to be perfectly honest. It's very discouraging. I mean, you take a heifer like this one here. I mean, this animal didn't ask for this. She wants us to take care of her and what have you. We have a lot of fun with our animals, and they mean a hell of a lot to us. And I always told them, you guys can screw around with my wife and myself all you like, but when you screw around with my animals, you cross the line. And in this situation, they've crossed the line. Same way with the fields that I grew up on that are now as highly contaminated as they are right now. It's I guess it kind of puts a face with what's going on. We could talk about this academically all we like, but when you start putting a name and a face with a thing, then it kind of brings it back to earth. And I'm not sure how this is all going to sugar out. You're dealing with the food supply is what you're screwing around with. And I think damn well that people need to be taking this seriously, because you are screwed around with your food supply.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Any other questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. I'm sorry, I'm not prepared as most people are. I'm a farmer, not a speech giver, I guess.
Thank you, Fred. And thank you for bringing this to light. I certainly understand when anyone makes a complaint and it's called anecdotal. Well, it's only anecdotal because it's them and not you. So I appreciate that you bring to light the realities of this problem when many people may have an experience but aren't bringing it forward. I would guess we can switch to the next slide, just asking a little conversation about the Farmers Union. And possibly Jenny.
And I think, Dari, I'm going to just speak to this slide. So I'm not sure where our Pennsylvania and Ohio, but just wanted to remind you that these 3 organizations are supporters of this webinar. Hopefully you've enjoyed your experience with this webinar, and we really appreciate those of you who are able to join us as viewers in our presentation, our presenters as well. And if you'd like to find more resources like this, please look into joining the Farmers Union. We have really good educational materials and opportunities for good conversations like this to be hosted. So we appreciate Dari's work in Pennsylvania Farmers Union, as well as New England and Ohio, who have joined to support.
Great. And we do have a little bit of time for Q&A. I did get several questions, which I'll read off and then toss to our speakers to see if anyone has ways of answering. One question we had was, which states or organizations are aggressively monitoring PFAS in consumer dairy products or other food products? And if anybody wants to jump in on that of our speakers, that would be great. Sorry to put you under that so quickly, Abby. To my knowledge, it is not being tracked, although the FDA has started testing some obscure food products like chocolate icing, but they are starting to check for some PFAS in the food supplies. The challenge with any of the contaminants is that it is specific. So there's multiple types of polyfluoroalkylides substances, just as there are so many other chemicals. So they may test for one, say PFOAs, PFOS, things like that. If you're not specific on the test, it doesn't necessarily show up. This is also, again, one of the challenges of saying, oh, we tested for something and we didn't find it. But again, Dr. McBride or Fred Stone, if either of you have anything to add to that.
Daria, I would just say that I don't know if you've seen the stories out of Michigan and Wisconsin, but Michigan is definitely surveying now on farms where sludge has been applied, because they have some data indicating there was some pretty serious contamination from, I've forgotten which city, the sludge in particular city. Wisconsin similarly is also monitoring now.
I can interject a little bit on that. There was a fellow from Michigan that called us at the farm, and he was quite concerned that his feed was contaminated and what have you, and he mentioned it. And again, this is off the rails, but Michigan's toxicologist stated that they weren't going to hunt for this. They weren't going to do any milk testing because they were afraid that if they found it in the milk, that they would have to notify the farmer, which would in turn have to notify the dairy that there might be a problem with their milk, and hence they might get shut off. And since they did not want to put their dairy farmers under that undue stress. And that is another situation where people are scared to death. Out and about and what have you, they are scared to death. because they do not want to get caught up in this meat grinder that we're caught up in. And that's another problem as far as trying to get testing done or trying to put a handle on this.
Okay, great. It's we understand. I certainly understand as a consumer it may be frightening, but it's like any addiction. If we don't shed a light on it, we don't know to stop. So we have another question. How many states have active programs encouraging farmers to accept biosolids? To my knowledge, it's in every one of our states. We have high concentrations where there's high population, so the East Coast and West Coast, but also, you know, around the Great Lakes areas. And, you know, for instance, Milwaukee has to send their sludge somewhere. They have a very interesting marketing plan by bagging it and call it Milorganite, Milwaukee sewage sludge. So it is land applied throughout the nation, not only to farmers, but also offered to home gardeners, landscapers, athletic fields, things like that. But also we have situations like, for instance, New York City had a load that they couldn't get rid of, so they put it on a train and sent it to Texas. So our folks in Texas that were concerned called it the poo-poo choo-choo. So it is in every state. We have a question. Are you aware of moves to classify all biosolids as Class A? I don't know if either of you have any, Dr. McBride or Fred, if you have any comment on that in your studies.
I could just comment that I heard that years ago that that's the way things were going to go, but I haven't seen clear evidence that that's the case.
Okay.
No, I haven't either, and the only thing that I can comment to that is that companies like Casello and what have you have been doing composting and taking municipal sludges from, depending upon however these systems are geared up, and composting them out. In fact, some sewer districts have been trying to do their own composting, and then making this available to the home gardener as a composted material that they can use on their flower gardens and on their vegetable gardens. And in Maine, those numbers on those things, I believe, are all above whatever standards the state of Maine has now come up with for composting for municipal sludges. Right.
Okay. And the challenge with a Class A is that it can be distributed without any kind of tracking, and again marketed as a compost. The term compost has no regulations, so not only can sewage sludge be used as a compost, but anything can be stirred in as long as you have some form of nutrient like nitrogen or phosphorus. So that is a challenge. I do want to just also, we have a question about water contamination and runoff, and I know Fred, you had experience with that, with being near the Kennebunk River. So if you can maybe comment on that, a little bit of a water issue, contamination from water runoff.
Yes, the fields that were the most highly contaminated, again, we've been using with USDA and NRCS for the last 70 or 80 years. I mean, it's so the ditching and what have you, and the runoff all goes to a natural retention pond, and then outlets directly into the Kennebunk River, which goes directly into the ocean, and you also have the endangered Atlantic salmon in there. The water level and that retention pond was tested to be 11 times the EPA standard of 70, which I would say is probably a problem. So yes, it does run off from those fields. It's finding its way into the waters of the aquifer that we were on. Lion's share of that aquifer is under our own fields. And again, that argument can be made that us may have contaminated that aquifer, which ended up being at the number. So I'm not sure if that really is a good way of answering, but yes, it does run off and it does move into the rivers. So yes, that is a problem.
Okay, great. I think another concern with sewage sludge effluents, the liquid, is that it's often used for irrigation in drought-prone areas like California and Arizona, where a lot of our vegetables and fruits are grown. We do have a question about, do we know how many agricultural acres receive biosolids or sludge in a year? I don't know if either of you have that number.
No, I don't. I know at one time when we were, I think in 04, when we last did any spreading, I think it was something like 314 or 315 licensed sites in Maine that could spread materials, including ours. And that would also include the places that we did custom spreading on in our own little area. I think that number has dropped down to 100 and some odd. I'm not positive. I'm not really positive exactly what those numbers would be in Maine.
Okay. And then finally, we do have some questions from a representative of the sludge industry, wondering if we would address some of the concerns about, farmers using the nutrients to maximize the recovery of carbon and carbon sequestration. So, a concern about, well, what are the pluses that we are not addressing in this conference? That as a question from the representative of the sludge industry. Organic matter stabilizing the area, and carbon stores and carbon sequestration. So just wondering, Dr. Bride, maybe you can address that, that balance between other nutrients versus the contaminants that we're concerned about.
Yeah, so again, I tried to point out that on the positive side of things, the addition of organic carbon to soil is a positive, no question. Is that a permanent addition of carbon to the soil? Well, no, of course it isn't. That organic matter does decompose over time. But yes, if you apply sludge frequently and at high application rates on soils, you can build up soil carbon. Keep in mind, you're also at the same time building up soil phosphorus and a number of other things, metals. And so it's not at all clear if the trade-off there is a good one. You have to consider that in our part of the world here in the Northeast, and in the Chesapeake Bay watershed especially, we have soils overloaded already in many of the counties in New York, in Maryland, in Delaware, and Pennsylvania, overloaded with phosphorus. And so if you put more organic carbon on, you're putting more phosphorus on, not to mention the nitrogen, and you're worsening the problem we have with water quality in the bays and in freshwater lakes. So it's a trade-off, and I just view that on, I put that carbon on the positive side of why you might want to apply sludge. But then you have to look over on the other side and say, well, in balance, is that enough to throw the balance in favor of putting a lot of contaminants in soil whose effects you simply don't understand, but some of which you do. And so in my view, that's just not enough to argue in favor of this kind of application.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're a little after 10, unless there's anything else that either Dr. McBride or Fred that you would like to add to it, to our conversation. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This program has been recorded, and we will be storing it on the Pennsylvania Farmers Union website. Again, this was sponsored by Pennsylvania Farmers Union, New England Farmers Union, and Ohio Farmers Union as an outlet for people to hear maybe something you haven't been hearing, and to express our investigation of potential contamination of our food supply and our farmers. Thank you, Dr. McBride, for speaking with us today. Thank you, Fred Stone, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And that's it.
Welcome.